space that I was supposed to do this from, so my apologies. Oh, hello. Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it. My name is Kim Wasserman, and I am the Director of Organizing and Strategy at the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. And I'm really excited to be here today and talk with you guys about our work and the work that we've done in Little Village. I know that there are a lot of folks that are part of the webinar, and so I want to make sure that if folks have questions or if folks have comments, that during the presentation, you all have a chance to submit your questions. So please feel free to send anything my way message-wise, and I will try to answer as many questions as possible as we are going through the presentation. But once again, thank you guys very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And so I think I just want to talk about our coal power plant campaign and the work that went into that and the work that we did, and again, answer any questions that folks might have along the way. One of the things that I did was share our website with you, just to give folks some background on who we are and what we do, and definitely feel free to browse it and send us any questions or any comments that you guys have. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, if that's all right with folks. Thanks. So as I mentioned, my name is Kim Wasserman, and I am the Director of Organizing and Strategy at LVEJO. And today we're going to be talking about our coal power plant campaign and the work that went into that to make that happen. The coal power plant campaign in our neighborhood took over almost 20 years to do here in our neighborhood. It was a huge campaign that took not just our community, but really the entire city of Chicago. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on the coal power plant, kind of what they did in the neighborhood, and the impact that they had in our neighborhood as well. And again, please feel free to hit me up with any questions that you might have along the way. So just to give folks some background, Little Village is a community on the southwest side of Chicago. We have about 95,000 residents total. At our largest, we had about 108,000 residents. But when the economic boom happened, we lost a lot of folks. A lot of folks left the city, left the state, left the neighborhood. But also a lot of families started to move in with one another. And so what we had was a huge rise in homes that were available in the neighborhood, but also an economic downturn as well. But regardless, as a community, we are butted up against a lot of industry. Chicago is an industrialized city. That's how it got its start. And so a lot of that industry still exists in our community. And I think back in the day, people didn't give a lot of thought to industry living, folks living next door to industry, right? A lot of times it was, how do you build not just industry, but homes where people can live and have folks work and live near each other. And so in our neighborhood, we have the Crawford coal power plant. And not only did we have the Crawford coal power plant, we had a street named after Crawford, we had churches named after Crawford, we had halls named after Crawford. So it was very evident early on that back in the day, industry and community were really well tied together. You fast forward to today's age, you don't really see that. A lot of the industry that we have now in our neighborhood kind of comes into this neighborhood because they know they can get away potentially with paying people less. They can use temp agencies. They can not care about the environment and not care about the people who live here. But back in the day, not just Crawford, but actually Illinois Bell, which eventually ended up becoming AT&T, was also located right near our neighborhood, and they had a huge complex in which they built homes and built churches and just really built a sense of community for their workers. So again, as I mentioned, in our case, we had the Crawford coal power plant. And the Crawford coal power plant really was emerging science back in the day. 60, 70 years ago, our coal power plant, the Crawford one, and the one right next door to us, the Fisk coal power plant in the Pilsen community, these were considered emerging technologies at their time. If you think back to when Chicago first put in the elevated train, when we first hosted the World's Fair here in Chicago, those things were powered by the Fisk coal power plant, right? And so at that time, this was considered to be the emerging science that was coming out. Edison himself signed the Getz book at the Fisk coal power plant because he had invented the first turbine that they used in their facility. And again, this powered the elevated train track, right? So it really put Chicago on the map in the sense of how we got our electricity, but then again, the things that we powered, like the elevated train and the World's Fair. So, you know, at that time, we didn't know as much as we knew about science. We didn't know as much as we knew about health and the environment. And so people were very excited to be able to go from lanterns and kind of just really makeshift electricity to being able to power whole buildings and whole communities, which was great at the time, right? So you fast forward 60 years, the community has changed drastically. We started off as a community that was primarily Bohemian and Czech and Eastern European. And with the building of the railroads, particularly in Chicago, you had a huge influx of Mexican workers coming into Chicago, being brought up into Chicago for work. So my grandfather, for instance, was brought up as a train engineer from our hometown in Mexico to work for the rail lines here in Chicago, and ended up becoming a repairman for UPS, I believe, back in the day. And so for a lot of our families, we ended up migrating to Chicago, particularly because of the jobs that were being both offered and the workforce that was needed here in the United States. And this is true for a lot of folks, not just Mexican Americans. I mean, you had a huge influx of Chinese, you had a huge influx of just different nationalities coming into Chicago as it was growing. And so over the years, our neighborhood particularly grew by leaps and bounds as a Latino community. I just want to make sure, I just want to check in because I'm not seeing a whole lot of action. I just want to make sure, folks, can you guys still hear me, and are we still good? Or have I been talking this whole time to myself? I hope not. Yes, okay, perfect, okay. So you fast forward, neighborhood has changed drastically. As I mentioned, in about 2000, we had about 108,000 people. And what we found was that in our neighborhood, there was a very large population of our folks who were dealing with asthma and respiratory issues. And so I was born and raised in Little Village. Pretty much have lived here almost my whole life. And we knew, right, folks in our family, our neighbors, in school, we knew that a lot of folks in our neighborhood had respiratory issues, but we never really understood why it was happening. And I don't think anybody ever really asked the question of why it was happening. It was just kind of one of those things where you have asthma, you know, it is what it is. And so we, as an organization, really wanted to understand from an environmental perspective, why was it that in our neighborhood, the asthma rate was so high? We had looked at different percentages across the city. And just so folks know, Mexican Americans actually have a fairly low asthma rate. Puerto Ricans actually have one of the highest asthma rates in the nation, but Mexican Americans actually have a fairly low asthma rate. Yet in our neighborhood, that statistic did not stand true. And we really wanted to understand why that was. And so what we ended up doing was going door to door and talking to our neighbors and trying to understand, number one, how's your air quality? Does everything seem good in the neighborhood? Do you see anything that should be of concern? Number two, how is your family's health? Does your family deal with any asthma? Are they dealing with any respiratory issues? And number three, do you think as a family member, do you know what this comes from? Is it hereditary? Is it environmental? Is it a combination of both? And the reality is the science out there has showed us that asthma, while yes, is partially hereditary, is also partially based on the environment that you live in, right? So it's a combination of two. If you have family members who have asthma, your parents, and you live in a neighborhood where your air quality is not good, you're probably going to find yourself or somebody in your family dealing with asthma. And so given that that was the case, we definitely had to recognize that the indoor air quality definitely plays a role in that, but as does the outdoor air quality. So we went door to door, and lo and behold, what we found was that a lot of people, as I mentioned, had respiratory issues, but not a lot of people knew why. And it wasn't like you could point to one thing and say that's causing the asthma, right? It definitely was something that we could not figure out what in our neighborhood was causing this to happen. And so what we ended up doing was, as a community, we walked around and we did something called an industrial inventory, where we walked around the neighborhood. And please understand, this is before internet, before the joys of Google, right? This is when you still had to use pen and paper and the local library to figure out information. We faxed. I think that was probably when faxes were kind of gaining momentum, but this is still like before you could just jump on a computer and Google the heck out of, you know, industries in my neighborhood, right? We had to walk around the neighborhood, and so it took us about 2 years. We walked around the neighborhood and started to document and write down all of the industry in our neighborhood. I mean, again, in a neighborhood like ours, it's not like industry is down the road and around the corner. Industry is legitimately right next door to us. And for a lot of our homes, it's right next door, across the street, next to a school, right? And so we recognized that there was some places that were really close and some places that actually were down the road. And in this case, what we found was that we had over 154 permitted industries in our neighborhood, of which one of them was a coal power plant. And when we came across the coal power plant, it was really interesting because, number one, 90% of our community had no idea that there was a coal power plant in our neighborhood. The smoke that came out of the smokestack was actually white and looked like steam. And so for a lot of folks, they were like, that's not a polluting industry. The smoke that comes out of there is white. How could it possibly affect us, right? It's not ugly, it's not brown, it's not stinky, right? It looks safe. And so for a lot of folks, they actually thought that the coal power plant was where they made charcoal, the charcoal that you barbecue with, the charcoal, like Kingsford charcoal. That's what a lot of folks, when they heard coal, that's what they associated, right? Is that this is where they make the charcoal that we barbecue with. And so even for myself and a lot of our staff, it was a learning opportunity, right? We started to do our homework. How does a coal power plant work? What do they do? What is the process that they take on? And so essentially how the coal power plant works is that they take coal and they boil it. And the steam that they use from the boiling is actually what turns the turbine to create electricity, right? And then that steam is what you see released out of the smokestacks, which is why it looks white and unassuming. But the reality is that pollution that's coming out of the smokestack is actually incredibly toxic. It has things like mercury, SO2, SOx and NOx. It has lead, right? It has a lot of pollution in it that not only causes environmental harm, but it actually also causes a lot of human harm. And so one of the things that we were seeing was not just elevated asthma rates in the neighborhood, but also elevated lead rates in the neighborhood, in our community's blood work, right? Because the reality is the smoke is coming out of the smokestack. It's not like it's being blown miles and miles away. That pollution is falling right on our community, right? And some of it is being carried off into other communities, but the most of it is falling right on our neighborhood, right? So we not only have homes surrounding the coal power plant, we also have a man-made canal, right, where there's fish and that folks use, but we also have hundreds of thousands of people who live around our neighborhood as well. And so in learning about and doing our research and learning as much as we could about how this coal power plant works, we realized that not only was our community suffering, but in reality, the entire city of Chicago and beyond was suffering. A couple of years ago, there had been some massive fires, forest fires in Minnesota. And in Chicago, you could actually smell the smoke coming from the forest fires in Minnesota. And so and that's a 7-hour drive. It's an hour flight, but it's a 7-hour drive. And so for us, I think it really showcased, right, how far air actually travels, right? In this case, you have to drive 7 hours to get to Minnesota. It took 2 days for that smoke to get here to our community, which leads us to believe that the pollution coming out of the smokestacks is also going potentially as far as other states as well. And so as a community, we were shocked, we were appalled that there would be a coal power plant in our neighborhood. And so again, in our research, we wanted to understand this. What we wanted to understand too was who do they supply electricity to? So I'm going to ask a general question. If you find a coal power plant in your backyard and it turns out that they're creating electricity, right? Who do you think that electricity was being supplied to? Right. So I'm just going to ask you guys, and anybody who feels they want to answer, please. Our coal power plant in our community is creating electricity. Who do you think that electricity was being sold to? And I'll give you guys a couple minutes to throw some answers in. Anybody? Let's see what we got. The government, okay, that's a good one. Any other ideas on who this electricity that's being created at the Crawford and the Fisk coal power plant, the main grid? Okay, that's great. So in our case, the electricity that was being created at the Fisk and coal power plants actually was not for the city of Chicago, and it was not for the state of Illinois. It was actually sold onto the open market, and in our case, the purchasers of that electricity were the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. So here is our community with the coal power plant in it, right, that's getting all of the pollution from the coal power plant. And I should clarify that we got no jobs from this coal power plant. There were about 160 workers at this coal power plant, and we could not find a single worker from our neighborhood. The closest that we ever got to finding somebody was a guy who dated a girl who knew a guy who had worked at the plant. So that was like legitimately how close we came to finding somebody in our neighborhood who actually worked there. So we didn't get the job, right? We didn't get the electricity, but what we did get was the byproduct, right? The pollution of the coal power plant. And so as a community, we were pissed. We were genuinely pissed because it's like, how in this day and age do profits matter over people, genuinely, right? Here you have an outdated source of how you create electricity that isn't even supplying electricity to our city or our state, and yet it's okay for them to continue to pollute with no problem, right? And so as we organized our community, and really a lot of it was just about education. We had to educate as many people as possible, because if you think about it, right, in our country, how many folks actually know where their power comes from, right? When you plug in your phone, when you plug in your TV, when you plug in your PlayStation, right, you're not necessarily thinking about where does that electricity come from, right? You just know that if you pay your bill, you're going to get electricity into your home, right? And so there really isn't a lot of thought process behind what am I plugging into. And in our case, as a community, we had to start from that. We had to start from that space. We had to start from a space where we had to talk to our community members about where does your electricity come from. So I have a question: who agrees to let these companies in? Local government. So in our case, that's exactly right. Because back in 60, 70 years ago, when these plants first came on the scene, right? Again, they were seen as new technologies. This is an industrial corridor next to a community. They said, this is a great place for you guys. It's by the river. You can use the water from the river. You can discharge into the river. You have jobs that are right off the highway. And so it made sense back then to put them in this space. But you fast forward, right, to a changing community, a community that's primarily Mexican, Mexican-American. And I should say, too, that as a community with 95,000 people, half of our population is under the age of 25, right? So that's a huge population of young people, of lungs that are growing, bodies that are growing, bodies that are maturing, right? Bodies that need as healthy of an environment as they can have to be able to grow to their full potential. But we didn't have that, right? We had an environment that was heavily polluted, and the single source of pollution, the largest single source of pollution in our community was this coal power plant. So once we educated a lot of our community members about what was happening, then we wanted to understand who agreed to put them here, right? How long can they be here for? Is there rules and regulations that they should be following? How can they reduce their pollution, right? If they want to be our neighbor, how do we ensure that they're a good neighbor, right? And they have the mutual respect as a member of our community that we do as a community, right? A lot of times in the morning you come into our neighborhood, folks are sweeping their sidewalk, right? They're cleaning up. We take pride in our neighborhood, right? As a community, this is where we live. And so for us, it's not just about coming and going every day. We have a very strong, vibrant cultural community here. You come into our neighborhood, there's murals, there's art, there's music, there's food, there's street vendors. Our main thoroughway, which is 26th Street, is second in tax revenue behind Michigan Avenue. And that has Prada, Gucci, Nike, for those of you who have come to Chicago and been down Michigan Avenue. It's the American Girl store. I mean, it is the who's who, right, of stores. Our little 26th Street, which has no big box and is primarily all mom and pop shops, is second behind Michigan Avenue in tax revenue, which tells us that as a community, we are economically strong, right? Our dollar goes far in our neighborhood. And so given that we're economically strong, given that we're a very young community, we wanted to understand what was the decision-making process that allows this to happen and how can we stop it, right? So in 2000, give or take, Harvard School of Public Health released a report that stated how not just this coal power plant, but all the coal power plants in Illinois were affecting the local community. And what we found out was that the Crawford coal power plant, just our one coal power plant in our neighborhood, was causing 40 deaths a year, 5,000 emergency room visits a year, and over 1,500 asthma attacks a year, just in our neighborhood alone. 40 people a year were dying in our neighborhood prematurely because of these coal power plants that did not provide us any jobs or any electricity. And so, as you can imagine, that pissed us off as a neighborhood. It's like, where is the justice in that? How is it okay for this company to kill 40 people a year and there is no repercussions for that, right? And so I think one thing to understand is that even when we have our research and even when we have our proof that this coal power plant was killing us, when we went to the mayor's office and outraged and asking for justice and asking for them to do something, we got the door shut on us. It wasn't like they were arms wide open saying, yes, we hear you, this is an injustice, let us help you, let us figure out how to solve this. No, instead what we got was, that's not our problem. They provide jobs. That's more important than the environment, right? And so it became very clear to us as a community that City Hall was not going to protect us. That if we were going to do something, we were going to have to do something on our own. And that's exactly what we did. We worked for almost 12 years, trying different tactics, trying different things. You name it, we tried it. We did petitions, we did marches, we did rallies, we did die-ins. We did art in the street, we did art in the neighborhood. We had something called the Coal Power Plant Olympics, where when Chicago was up for the Olympics, we tied Olympic Games into it and talking about how are we going to have the Olympics with these two disgusting coal power plants in the background. And actually, one of the things we were able to do is we were actually able to talk to the Olympic committee in downtown Chicago when they came. Oprah got to talk to them. Everybody got to talk to them, all the who's who of Chicago, in an effort to get the Olympics to come here. And here we are, this little group from the south side of Chicago that gets to go talk to them and say, no, don't bring the Olympics here because the air quality here sucks. And how are you going to clean up the air for thousands of people who are coming here for 2 weeks, yet you can't clean the air up for the people who live in Chicago? And so what we did was, when we realized that we were going to have to do this on our own, we started organizing community by community. We started going to the neighborhoods where we knew people voted, where we knew the elected officials were held accountable, where we knew folks would understand what it is that we're talking about. Are there laws that state these plants have to list the expected pollutants that will be expelled from their stacks? So by law, they do have to list what their pollutants coming out are. And actually at the very top of the smokestack, what you have is this really cool thing, which is a light beam that shoots from one side of the smokestack to the other. And there's a mirror there that bounces it back. And so depending on how long it takes that light to go through the emissions and back again, tells them how much they're polluting. And what was interesting is that by law, in their permit, it stated that they had to keep track of that and give those results to, in this case, I think it was the US EPA on a regular basis. And what we found was that they were actually violating what's called the opacity, right? So the opacity is how thick the smoke was and how long it took that light to go through it. So the thicker it is, the longer it takes that light to go through and bounce back again. And that tells the scientists, the engineers, the permit writers that the thicker it is and the longer it takes, the more pollution they're actually putting out. So the problem isn't per se that they have to list it. The problem per se is who's monitoring it and keeping track of it, right? Because the US EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, is underfunded, right? They're the only agency really that's out there protecting the environment, right? And so if their resources are limited, if they don't have the capacity to go to every single coal power plant and every single industry that's permitted by them to check on these things, you're kind of at the mercy of the company to be telling you and doing the right thing. And in this case, when we looked into that opacity, we found that they were actually violating their permit. And so that was one of the tactics that we used. It took lawyers, it took engineers and scientists, and it took just a lot of work to just on a legal front be able to deal with them. And I can tell you that the coal power plant shut down 2 years ago, and we are still in that legal battle. And so I think that gives kind of a snapshot of the fact that as much as folks want to sue, right, and we get sue happy in this country, it's a slow process, right, that as community members, we don't necessarily have the time for, or the patience for, per se, right? And so we knew that using the law was only one part of a bigger strategy, right? So we were on the ground, protesting, marching, talking smack about the company publicly. Then we also decided to get in on their shareholders, right? So as a company, they have stock, right? So they're on the stock market, which means that they have to have shareholders. So we worked with Loyola University to get, they had shares in the coal company, and they had strategically bought shares in the coal company to try to help us out. And so as stakeholders, they were coming at them hard saying, look, you have a responsibility. right? You need to clean up your work. You know, you can't be killing 40 people a year. So they were getting it at a local level. They were getting it from a stockholder level. And then we also joined forces with folks like Sierra Club and Greenpeace. These are organizations who, you know, have the capacity, have the budgets really to carry out, you know, some really big media campaigns. We're a small organization. We're in the, I can't tell here, but we're in the basement of a building, right? And so we're a very small organization. Our whole budget could go to pay for a billboard on the side of the highway. And so what we did was we partnered with folks like Sierra Club and Greenpeace to do a massive publicity campaign against Midwest Generation, which was the coal power plant. And what we did was we took a picture of my son. His name is Peter, and he is asthmatic. And it was just a picture of him with his inhaler. And basically what it said was, meet Chicago's new air filter. It's Peter, right? And so really trying to emphasize the fact that these coal power plants were causing and exacerbating the health of our children in our community. And that happened at the same time that our former mayor, Mayor Daley, had announced his retirement. And so the entire time that Mayor Daley was in office, we knew that we were not going to get him to do anything. Every ordinance we tried, everything we had tried either got stuck in committee, which means there's this expression that says it dies in committee. They didn't push it out of committee. Now, some folks may ask, you know, where were your local public officials? In Chicago, we have aldermen. In our case, our public officials were nowhere to be found. In Little Village, our alderman was being bought out by the coal power plant, and in Pilsen, the neighborhood right next door to us that has the Fisk coal power plant, their alderman was being bought out. And so I have another question for you guys. Let's say you're the alderman of our neighborhood, right, and you're being bought out by the coal power plants. How much money do you think it took for our alderman and or the Pilsen alderman to be bought out? So I'm going to ask for amounts. If you don't have an amount, great. Glad to hear that you're not viable. But if you do have an amount, what amount do you think these guys took? So it's two aldermen, Pilsen, Little Village. They both have a smokestack in their neighborhood. How much money do you think these guys took from the coal power plant in order to stay silent and in order to not say anything and not let this coal power, not let anything happen to them? Any ideas on how much money it took to buy them out? 50,000? Okay. Anybody else? I can tell you that that's too high. Any other guesses on how much money these guys took? 15 each, 30, okay. Anybody else? Any other amounts? Any other guesses? Before I tell you? 10K, okay, we're getting close. So in our case, our alderman for Little Village was getting $5,000. And I repeat, $5,000 was what he was asking for. And in Pilsen's case, actually, that alderman was a little bit smarter. He not only took money from them in the range of about anywhere from like 15 to 20,000, but he actually had 60. I wish, but no. In Pilsen's case, he actually had I think it was the vice president of the coal company was on his fundraising committee for being alderman. So he not only was taking money from them, but he was legitimately working with them. Both for his gains, you know, and ultimately for theirs. And so I think for us as a neighborhood, it was, you know, just heartbreaking to know that here our public official was selling us out for $5,000 a year. You know, 90,000 people, half of them under the age of 25, and apparently our worth is that of $5,000. And so our young people we work with, and our main thrust of work is through our young people, were outraged and wanted the general public to know that this guy was selling us out for $5,000. And so it was really interesting. What ended up happening was we got this information on a Friday. And our youth put together a very, the city actually, from what we understand, the city itself didn't get any money from them per se. But in our neighborhood, not only did the aldermen get money, but they had bought out everybody from the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce through most of the businesses in our neighborhood, including our local Chamber of Commerce, either through donations of funds for grants, donation of turkeys every year for Christmas. They were systematically buying out people in our neighborhood, right? And so here we are, this one little group that's saying, no, They're horrible. Don't take money from them. Don't take, programming from them, much less, let's fight against them. And we were fighting, an uphill battle. And so it took years for us to convince people that they shouldn't take money from them. So let me back up and say two things. So our youth found out on Friday they were livid. And so they put out a flyer on Saturday that said, our alderman is selling us out for $5,000. Literally that Sunday, in the local newspaper, there was I'm sorry, no, not that Sunday, that Monday, there was a story in our local newspaper with our alderman on the front page with him basically saying that he has been dealing with alcoholism for the last couple of years, that he has had a moment of clarity, that he's been working to get clean, and that he realized that he had made a mistake the last couple of years in regards to taking money from the coal power plant, and that now he was going to fight against them, and that he was going to help push forward an ordinance to shut them down. And it was amazing to us as an organization, and it's particularly our young people, on how, if he had an alcoholism problem, I'm glad that worked out for him and that he had his moment of clarity. But in regards to this campaign, a lot of us felt that it was just a cover, if you will, for just bad decisions that he had made. We were glad to have his support, and it actually, him changing from one side to the other is part of what made the difference. Because here we are in the city of Chicago where we have 50 aldermen. In order to get an ordinance passed, you have to have 25 aldermen plus one in favor of your ordinance. We couldn't get anybody because our aldermen plus one in favor of your ordinance. We couldn't get anybody because our own alderman wouldn't support us, right? And so the alderman would say to me, where's your alderman at? Well, he doesn't support us. Well, how can I support you if he doesn't support you, right? And so it was incredibly difficult for us to get anywhere without our alderman. And so we recognized was, if we couldn't get him to see clearly based on pulling on his moral heartstrings, right? 40 people a year, half of our population under the age of 25, like how is this okay with you? Then we realized that we were going to have to find out the realities about him. And finding out that he was getting $5,000 was what we needed to know. And so literally it just took one weekend of putting that information out there to the general public to get him to flip. Now in Pilsen's case, that didn't go so easy. In their case, that alderman literally had to go into a runoff. He almost lost his position because of this issue. We came out strong supporting the other candidate because they were talking about the coal power plant, and they were calling him out on selling out, right, and taking money from them. And so he literally had to get into a runoff before he flipped as well. And so once both of them flipped, every other alderman kind of fell in line behind them and said, okay, you want to deal with the coal power plants? Let's do this. And so what we were able to do was introduce an ordinance that basically stated that the coal power plants either had to clean up or shut down. Now, let me be clear in stating that we've never advocated, nor will we ever advocate, for the cleanup of a coal power plant. There is no such thing as clean coal. Coal is a dirty fossil fuel that requires extraction from the earth and causes a multitude of harmful effects, both from extraction to burning to coal ash, which is the byproduct of coal burning. And so for us, that's not a solution that we advocate for. But part of the realities of being in a city like Chicago is that sometimes you have to compromise. And so we came to the table with an understanding that cleanup might be an option, but that was not what we wanted. What we wanted was a shutdown. And so we wrote the ordinance in a way that would make it so difficult for them to have to clean up and so expensive that they would have no choice but to shut down. And so once both of our aldermen flipped, and once Mayor Daley retired or announced his retirement, that's kind of when the whole trifecta happened, in the sense that everything came together in order for us to make this one of the top issues of the next mayoral election. And that's what happened. Once Mayor Daley just said that he was retiring, all of these candidates came out and said, we're running for mayor, including Rom. So you had Rom, you had a whole bunch of people who said, we're going to run for office. And because of our partnership with people like Sierra Club and Greenpeace, we were able to get this question as one of the top 3 questions in all of the mayoral debates, right? So what would you do about education? And what would you do about jobs? And then the question was, what would you do about the 2 coal burning power plants in Chicago? And so in this case, Rahm Emanuel did make a promise, right? When he ran, he said, look, if I become mayor, I will deal with the coal power plants. And sure enough, he won. And within a year of becoming mayor, he said to us, I have some priorities. I have some things I need to work on before I get to the coal power plant. Fine, no worries. You got to do what you got to do. We're going to continue to do our work. And that's what we did. We continued to put pressure on the mayor's office. This is when our billboard campaign came out. We were on every CTA bus, every CTA train. There, that picture of Peter was on the side of the highway. It was on the front page of the Red Eye. Everybody and their mama was talking about this campaign. And sure enough, within a year of Rahm Emanuel being in office, he reached out and said, okay, I'm ready. What are we doing? He said, well, we have an ordinance. It's getting ready to go into city council to get voted on. What do we do? He's like, all right, let me call them, give them one last chance to figure out what they want to do. Otherwise, we're pushing this ordinance through. Now, what's really interesting, and one of the things that I love the most out of this work is that ordinance, that little teeny tiny ordinance that we worked on, had not only our coal power plant scared, but it had every coal power plant in the nation watching us. Because what this little city ordinance did was allow a city like Chicago to technically regulate coal power plants in their city. And so every other coal power plant across the nation was literally calling Midwest Generation, telling them, you cannot let this law pass. You cannot let this ordinance pass, because if you do, every other city and state in the union could technically adopt a similar law and regulate their coal power plants. And so for us as an organization, we were like, yes, this is it. This is what we want. We want to empower communities, right, across the nation to tackle their coal power plants. And if this is the way to do it, then let's do it. Again, you know, we're learning about the politics and how this stuff works. And the mayor, in his case, was like, look, let me see what I can do. And sure enough, he called him and said, look, you either shut down or give me a plan on how you're going to transition, or I'm going to let this ordinance go through. And Midwest Generation had no choice, both because of the pressure they were getting from the other coal power plants, but also the pressure they were getting from the mayor. They had no choice but to shut down. They couldn't let this ordinance pass. They weren't going to be able to afford to do what the ordinance said. So they ultimately ended up originally coming out with a statement in February saying that they were going to shut down Fisk that year and that Crawford would shut down 2 years later. We were like, that's not acceptable as a community. These two coal power plants need to shut down now, not in 2 years, you know, because 2 years means another 80 people are going to die. 2 years means that how many more young people in our neighborhood are going to be affected by asthma. So from February until May of that year, we continue to put a hardcore press. Even though things were working, even though things were moving, we continue to put a hardcore press on the coal power plant. And ultimately what ended up happening is in May, the coal power plant came out with another press release that said, as of August, both of the coal power plants would be shut down. And so for us as a community, it wasn't good enough just getting a 2-year deadline. We wanted one now. And that's what we fought for. And so I think if one thing this campaign has taught me over the many, many years that it's taken, right, is to stay true to what our community wants and to stay true to who we are as a community. Nobody knows better than our community what we want and what's right for us. And so when our community is telling us that a 2-year deadline is not sufficient, right, yet we have other folks, politicians, of, oh, that's good enough. Oh, they take what you got. You know, cut your losses. They're at least leading, right? No, that's not good enough. That's not what we want, and we want more, right? And so, you know, it definitely taught us about how do we ensure that what we're demanding as a community is respected, right? And isn't taken up into this conversation of what's politically feasible, right? You know, let's compromise. I'm down to compromise, right? But when a company chooses to ignore you for 12 years, when a company acts like your community isn't important, when a company has no problem with 40 people a year in your neighborhood dying because of them, I don't know how much room for compromise there really is, right? So lo and behold, they shut down. We're incredibly happy as a community, but then it dawns on us as a community, right? We fought so long and so hard to shut them down that we had never given any thought to what happens after they shut down, right? What happens when all the jobs are gone? What happens when they're not here anymore? What happens to the property that's 60 acres in our community? What are they going to do with it, right? And so all of a sudden here they are shutting down, and people want to start talking about, oh, it's prime real estate, right? Let's get another industry into this community. Let's get another tax base into this neighborhood. And we were like, whoa, 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 slow down, right? We have to talk to the community. We need to understand from them, what do they want? Right? What do they want to see here? What kind of jobs does our community want? It's not just a question of having another industry come in. It's a question of How do you balance, right, industry coming in and the need for jobs with environment and health, right? How do you have a conversation that takes into account both? So back to your question of who put these folks here, right? It's not the same folks who put the coal power plant there 60 years ago, but that mentality, that thought process is still there, right? To this day, communities like ours are constantly being sold this notion of, you need jobs. Everybody needs jobs. It's economically hard out there. Let's give you jobs. Don't ask questions on what the company does. Don't worry about the toxicity that they put out. Don't worry about the pollution. Don't worry about how your health as a worker there is going to be impacted. Let's focus on the jobs, right? And so for us as a neighborhood, we said no, right? What good is a job if you're going to die from it, right? What good is a job if it's not going to pay and offer me a good living wage or health insurance? What good is a job if all it's doing is polluting my community even more, right? So as a neighborhood, we said, no, we want to slow this conversation down. And we as a community want to have a say in what happens in our neighborhood. And so sure enough, what we were able to do was work with the mayor and work with the Pilsen groups and our neighborhood groups and the owners and sit down at the table. And it took us 2 years. 2 years, I had to sit across the table from the owner of this coal power plant. This is a man who I despised. This is a man whose life I had made very difficult, right, in the last 12 years. And now here I am, sitting at a table right across from him, telling him what he can and cannot do with his property. Telling him what he can and cannot do, how he can and cannot sell it. And it was crazy, right, because we hated each other with a passion, right? And so the city was like, look, the reality is we can no longer make decisions like this. We can no longer make decisions just based on economics, right? As a community, this community fought for over a decade to shut them down. If the mayor tries to put something there that we don't want, how much more do you think we're going to fight, right? So they knew that the community had to be on their side in order to make anything happen. And sure enough, they brought us together. They had to bring in a professional facilitator because a lot of tension in the room. And what we were able to do over the course of 2 years is create guiding principles that basically talk about how you can and cannot redevelop the coal power plant. And so the company adopted those principles, and when they sold the land to another company, those principles were part of the sale. They could not sell that property without the new owners signing on. And so I'll give you some examples of what the guiding principles are. Number one, whatever industry moves into that property cannot be polluting. It has to be state-of-the-art and have the best controls of any kind, depending on what they want to do. It has to be some kind of green technology. They have to have green infrastructure. We have a huge flooding problem in our community. So they have to be able to take on their water issues and the surrounding water issues as well. They have to pay a living wage, which means in Chicago right now, $15 an hour. We didn't specifically ask for union jobs, but we did ask for living wage jobs. They have to be multi-use, so it can't just be industry. We want industry with commercial, with open space. We want a campus type of a situation on that property, not just one industry. They have to offer training opportunities for community members, and they have to hire locally. And so these are the types. Oh, plus, I'm sorry, the last one is that there can be no housing on this property, which is fine with us. I mean, I don't know if anybody wants to live in an industrial area, but for us, this is really, it showed us that there was so much more to fighting for justice, right? There's so much more to fighting for the environment than just the air, the water, and the land. What we recognized is that part of our conversation had to include economics. It had to include social justice, right? It had to include education. And so it definitely taught me as an individual that I can't look at the environment just through one lens. I have to look at it through a lot of different lenses to ensure that my community is as safe as possible on a holistic level, right? Incorporating everything, not just the air I breathe. And so, we've definitely learned a lot as an organization. The land has not been developed. The coal power plant is still sitting there abandoned and empty. And unfortunately, the company who bought it, NRG, is looking like they're going to be bankrupt. And so I think this is an indication of the fossil fuel industry in the United States, right? And unfortunately, coal power plants are not economically viable anymore. And so as a community, we're continuing to work on our vision of that property. We have a lot of different ideas of what we want to do, and we're trying to find the right partners and the right funding to make those things happen. We continue to talk with NRG, who's the new owner, and they're supportive. But this is a abandoned property for them. It's not high on their priority list, and so until they can get their money back, they really aren't going to do anything with it. And so as a community, it does fall on us partially to make sure that our vision gets carried out moving forward so that we can be part of the conversation, because otherwise the same thing will happen again. They'll just put some industry there without any consideration or conversation with our community, and we are once again going to be fighting, who knows what. And so we are definitely learning how to get on the front end of a lot of these conversations versus being on the back end of them. And so I'll stop there and ask if folks have any questions, any thoughts, any clarifications that I can give. No questions? Anything I can talk about that folks wanted me to mention? All right. Well, can we volunteer with you? Absolutely. So just so folks know, we are, again, located on the southwest side of Chicago. We are in the Little Village community. We have tons of volunteer opportunities available. This year we're hosting a series of events called Green for the People, and we're always in the need of volunteers. So please feel free to reach out to us via Facebook, email, come by and visit us. We'd love to have folks. And just to let folks know too, we have something called a toxic tour that we offer, in which we give tours of the community, other other industries, and other things that we've worked on as a community. So let me answer a couple of questions. Were there any benefits from the plan? The only benefit that we found was a tax-based benefit, right? So as an industry, just like a homeowner, they have to pay taxes. That was the only benefit locally that we could find. And since they've closed, obviously that tax revenue is no longer there, which is why it's important for us to get somebody on that property to reinvigorate it and give money back to the city. So legitimately, that's about the only benefit we found. Have you tried to close down any other plants that are polluting the area? So I don't know that we've tried to close down other plants as much as we've tried to work with other plants. There's a lot of small mom and pop industries in our communities, everything from mechanics to car painters to plastics recycling, metal recycling. There's just a lot of industry in our neighborhood, and a lot of it is local. And so it's not, and a lot of them employ locally and are a benefit locally. And so it's not our goal to shut them down as much as it's our goal to give them an understanding of how they're impacting the environment and how they should, again, try to be a better neighbor. So a lot of times we work with the Environmental Protection Agency, the city, to get them funding, to make changes, to retrofit, to get better technologies into their business so that they can be protective of human health and the environment as much as possible. And so in the case of the coal power plant, we try to do that and it didn't work. But more importantly, in the coal power plant's case, again, because of the fossil fuel issue, because of who they provided electricity to, it just became a much larger conversation. Are most of these companies willing to work with you? It's interesting. When we first started, it was very difficult. But after we shut down the coal power plant, everybody and their mama wanted to talk with us because they were scared that we had taken down Goliath, and they were worried that we were going to come after them next. I think an art museum is a great idea. Were the 40 people who died here somewhere else or in the community? The 40 people who died were in the community. So the Harvard School of Public Health looked at each distinct neighborhood that a coal power plant was located in, and Pilsen had different numbers than we did. I think they had less deaths a year than we did, but in Crawford's case, it's 40 people locally a year who were dying. Housing, so we did talk about housing for the coal power plant, but because it is in an industrial area, it's just not conducive to living there. I mean, you have an asphalt company across the river from you, you have a huge industrial park on the other side of you, there's a garbage sorting facility on the other side, and so it definitely is an industrial space and needs to be kind of maintained in that manner. But again, what kind of industry is kind of is what we want to have a say in, right? We don't want it to be another coal power plant. Another thing that's bubbling up in Illinois is the potential for incinerators. We don't want incinerators in our community, much less in our state. And so we are fighting to ensure that our community not only gets a voice in the process, but gets a voice in this decision and all decisions when it comes to industry in our community. Again, because the reality is industry isn't down the road miles away, it's legitimately right next door to our homes. So again, any questions, any comments that folks may have, please keep them coming. I'd love to answer any questions before we finish. And again, thank you guys so much for being patient. I apologize. My internet at home is not working and I had to fly over here to get online. So thank you guys very, very much. And again, please feel free to come by and check us out if you happen to be in Chicago. Like I mentioned, we offer toxic tours, which I would highly recommend if you want to come as a class or if you want to come and just take a walk around the neighborhood. It takes anywhere from about an hour to 2 hours. You can learn all about the neighborhood. Just to let folks know, some of the things we've done besides shutting down the coal power plant is we fought for 20 years to get a brand new park in our neighborhood, and we won that in 2014. So we have a brand new 23-acre park in the neighborhood. And then we also fought for 15 years to get a new bus line in our neighborhood, and we won that in 2013. So a lot of great victories in the neighborhood, a lot of great work in the neighborhood, and we continue to just ensure that we have environmental justice in our community, for all. So I hope that this has been helpful, informative, inspiring in some capacity. And again, I thank you guys very much for taking the opportunity to listen to just some lady from the southwest side of Chicago who's looking to make her neighborhood a better place. So thank you guys very, very much. And I think I'll end with that. Thank you guys. Thank you so much.